Tonight's class will be on the AFL-CIO role in the 1973 Chilean coup. So I want to give a couple of disclaimers first. If anybody was on last month's class, we did say at the end of it that it was going to be on the history of the National Labor Federations. But that was an oversight on our part, as last month was the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile. And the AFL-CIO unfortunately played a major role within that coup. So we figured we would alter that and give that the due it's deserved. And second of all, yesterday, October 3rd, 2023, was the 78th anniversary of the Raw Federation of Trade Unions.
Well, just want to make it clear that the AFL-CIO is used in this situation. There are, of course, elements within the AFL-CIO leadership who allowed it to happen knowingly and through various reasons, or they uh, were stooges for the CIA, for the corporations in Latin America, and but it's um, a issue of class collaboration, of a suppression of class-oriented trade unionism in this country, and um, a fight that we have to wage from within the AFL-CIO to win it back to the side of workers.
All right, we're gonna break this session down into two parts. We're gonna go over what was the American Institute for Free Labor Development, or AFIELD, in its modern incarnation is the Solidarity Center of the AFL-CIO. And then we're going to go through what is AFIELD's role up to and during the September 11th coup. What was the American Institute for Free Labor Development? The American Institute for Free Labor Development, or AFIELD, was an AFL-CIO organization set up in 1962 by then AFL-CIO President George Meany, whose purpose was to undermine foreign class-oriented unions. It received funding from the U.S. government, mostly through USA, what is now USAID. Then it was just called AID. And starting in the 1980s, it began receiving funds from the National Endowment for Democracy. The AFIELD also had close ties to the Central Intelligence Agency. The new organization invited some of the most powerful American businessmen with heavy investments in Latin America to sit on its board, including representatives of Exxon and Shell oil corporations, IBM, Coppers, and Gillette. It made J. Peter Grace head of the United Fruit Company, the biggest foreign landowner in Latin America, as its chair. And as you can see the picture here, that's George Meany, then AFL-CIO president. AFIELD was obviously committed to making the hemisphere's impoverished countries safe for U.S. investors by whatever means, not excluding support for military coups. It selected William C. Dougherty Jr. as its executive director, who former CIA agent and whistleblower Philip Agee described as a CIA, quote unquote, CIA agent in labor operations, and was said to have been a CIA conduit for passing agency funds to foreign labor leaders. AFIELD had a variety of programs to build loyalty among workers in foreign countries, which would later be exploited in the interest of American multinational corporations. With the help of CIA funding, it was able to build housing projects for workers in Uruguay that cost several $1 million and provide other AFIELD enticements to get workers to oppose the mainstream labor federation. I just want to point out that these housing projects make the housing projects in the U.S. look like they are of perfect construction. In Ecuador, it trained thousands of workers in the principles of labor management relations and the free market economy offering them money for attending the classes. Doherty, who was actually a son of a union member, explained A-Field's mission to Congress. Our collaboration with business takes the form of trying to make the investment climate more attractive and inviting. J. Peter Grace, head of the W.R. Grace conglomerate and chairman, explained bluntly that the Institute, quote unquote, teaches workers to increase their company's business, what we call class collaboration. In the course of its career, A-Field is said to have trained 243,668 actual and potential trade union officers in virtually every Latin American and Caribbean country. Of those, more than 1,600 received special training and pay at installations in the United States. And we're going to give a brief overview of how A-Field worked. A-Field channeled substantial amounts of money directly into right-wing company unions and individuals. The transfer took place, however, so that the money couldn't be traced back easily to the United States government. To launder the money, A-Field relied on the International Trade Secretariats, or ITSs, which are large international labor federations organized along the lines of a specific trade or profession. Most national or international unions in the United States are affiliated to a corresponding ITS. The secretariats played this role more easily than A-Field for three basic reasons. They are international organizations they are deeply embedded in the trade union structures, and they have a long history of CIA connections. The advantage of having an international bagman is especially evident in the funding of Latin American unions, since it makes it almost impossible to trace the flow of funds from the point of origin to the final destination. The money flowed through the system on the basis of subcontracts. First, AID, now USAID, would contract with A-Field. Then A-Field would subcontract with one of 6 U.S. unions designated by the AFL-CIO's Director of the International Affairs Department. In the case of Chile, it was the Communication Workers of America. Each of these unions would then hand the money over to their respective ITS, where it was earmarked for the ITS Inter-American Office. In most cases, there was no way to distinguish the U.S. Union from the ITS Inter-American Office. Finally, the money was allocated by the Inter-American offices for use, quote unquote, whenever necessary in Latin America. Along the circuit, the money lost its nationality, traceability, and accountability. The ITS wasn't accountable to U.S. taxpayers or union members for the allocation of these funds, and so the link tying donor to donee was broken. This process was known as A-Field's quote unquote union to union program. And now we're going to show a short clips from an interview that was done on the YouTube channel labeled video from someone we have worked with in Louisville named Steve Zeltzer, who interviewed Ruth Needleman, who was in Chile leading up to the coup in 1973 and is considered the foremost expert on the coup. We clipped together pieces from the interview, as the interview was over an hour and a half long. So we're going to see some clips throughout this presentation.
Had the names of people that worked for A-Field, people in the State Department.
And what is A-Field?
The American Institute for Free Labor Development was created as part of the Alliance for Progress. It was the labor arm, although the people in A-Field, all the top people who were appointed by George Meany, came out of the CIA. So, for example, Serafino Romualdi was the first head of A-Field. Prior to that job, he worked for the what was it called? the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA. He had been in charge of Berlin for the CIA prior. So the founding members of AFLD were all intelligence people. George Meany was always a pain in the butt to the State Department, to the government, until Nixon got elected.
And George Meany was head of the AFL-CIO.
CIO, yes. And he had come out of the plumbers union. He was always a skilled tradesman who thought that the labor movement consisted of skilled trades, and that organizing Blacks, Latinx, Asians, Native Americans, women was a waste of time. And so he was more advanced in his hatred of anything progressive than most governments he worked under until Nixon got elected. As a matter of fact, I had so many interesting, George Meany from, I would say, post-World War II on, controlled everything that had to do with labor, not the State Department. As a matter of fact, they were at war with each other. The State Department repeatedly, as well as the Congress, called for the defunding of AFLD. Because if George Meany wanted to send a CIA person to be labor attaché, there was nothing the State Department could do. They tried. This one appointment, they vetoed 3 times, and he still ended up in the position. I don't remember where in Latin America. Meany was too powerful, and he controlled, and for him, labor was not his interest. And everybody who worked with AFLD said that the main interest of AFLD was not education, not even reactionary education. It was an operation to bring down communist control of unions, countries, movements, whatever. And the more I interviewed, the more people, not only these liberals in the State Department, and I interviewed 3 or 4 of them, but reactionaries in labor who were part of this scheming underworld, they told me what they were doing. I had, top people in AFLD tell me that the job was not to build democratic trade unions. The job was to get the communists out. And they said, we no longer teach trade unionism. And this was the person who followed Serafino. This would be Doherty, Bill Doherty, who was a real gem. He too came out of intelligence. Doherty said, what we teach is what we learned when we got the communists out of the AFL and the CIO. We teach them how to isolate them, how to build a force against them. And I can't give you the whole quote because it was long, but I have all these quotes. And another guy who was very honest, Wally Legge, worked for PTTI, Communications International Trade Secretariat.
Burn.
That's right. CWA was controlled by an anti-communist, feverish, warrior, Byrne. And he literally gave Front Royal, the AFLD Training Center, to them as a gift. I think he sold it to them for $100 or something. And he had been involved through PTTI. So if you look at all these PTTI people, it was just like all these maritime people. They were all CIA infiltrated. And what the ITSs did, International Trade Secretariats, they had become almost useless after the Second International fell apart. But they were not US the way the AFL was. Therefore, and they were European based. They could send people, CIA agents, into Chile working for the ITS because they weren't checked. The money was, sources were never checked. And so the money, if it went to the AFL at all, they gave it to the ITS in Europe, who brought it back into Chile and gave it, they paid literally for the October strike, for the strikes in copper in April. They funded Fatherland and Liberty, which was the militia group that reminds me of some other militia groups we now know, who created chaos in the streets trying to provoke the left, which never worked. And they just told me these things. I had the names of.
I don't know what I was going to say other than it's a pattern. It reminds me of the kind of things that were happening in Poland.
Yeah, it's something that repeated itself over and over, and unfortunately is still happening.
I'm glad they were having tonight's class. So far, I'll be honest with you, I'm impressed. Whoever put it on, I'm impressed. It's very good. This information was needed. It was very instrumental what happened in Eastern Europe. They didn't stop after 1945. They continued, and they won. They got what they wanted in 1991. And it was a continual struggle and money that was spent. And don't kid yourself, it's going on right now with you in Venezuela against the Venezuelan government, and it'll keep going on. And the governments that have become influenced by the workers in that country to take a pro-working class direction for the poor and not deal with the American corporations are going to be victims to this kind of thing. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And I'll also add, we have a relationship here with Lowell with the Cath Union in Haiti, and in some of our bilaterals, they have expressed that it's going on there now too.
Yeah, is it? So I know it was mentioned I don't remember, it was the ITS, like the international secretaries. So is it, I guess, as far as who was involved, I don't know the whole makeup with how the AFL and the CIO operate with the unions, but is it safe to assume that the union leadership in most of those trade unions were involved as well, or was it kind of AFL-CIO on their own? That was just my question.
Well, the AFL-CIO is a federation of unions, and there was 6 main unions that were involved in these types of actions. But with Chile, specifically to Chile, it was mainly the Communication Workers of America. And I don't remember if it was put in the presentation, but we will share the link out for the full interview on social medias, and we'll try to get it on here before the end of the class for this interview. But it is mentioned in there that the CWA basically gave AFLD their trading center. They sold it to them for something like $100. So there was CWA and a couple other unions were specifically involved with their leaders. They had corrupted leadership at the time, but it was mainly like Ruth Needleman said in that interview. It mainly ran through George Meany.
There was something that Ruth said. She was saying that George Meany was above and beyond more reactionary than even the State Department. He was the most anti, basically, labor before the administration caught up with him with Nixon, under Nixon. But in reality, all along, the State Department, the interests of the bosses at the time aligned with George Meany. It's no coincidence that his involvement in his his skills to them played such a critical role in Latin America. It was just at that point in time when it seemed like he was ahead of the State Department. It was only because the State Department at that time could not actually reveal its truly heinous anti-labor positions that George Meany was able to do. And so he is a useful tool. In all reality, he is what they are thinking, what they want to do. But in some situations, they can't for whatever reason.
The International Trade Union Confederation, what's its relationship to the AFL-CIO? Is the AFL-CIO a member, or does it control it?
The answers to those two questions are yes.
Okay, so that's why I talk. They basically take the AFL line and push coups.
Well, the ITUC was formed by the AFL-CIO and the CIA, similar to AFLD.
Yeah, the International Trade Union Federation was formed in response to the WFTU, the World Federation of Trade Unions, which was set up by the UN at the end of World War II, which included one of the founding members was the CIO. But it was basically the ITUC was basically in order to separate not only American labor from the rest of the international labor movement, but to work internationally to separate the internet parts of the international labor movement away from the WFTU, which was led by the USSR.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I just want to mention that after World War II, the world came out fighting against fascism and the world won. It was a united allied effort. So they set up the United Nations so that we could all work together against fascism. That was the idea. But in 1947, the United States decided to throw out the elements within the Roosevelt administration, actually Henry Wallace. They threw him out. He was the vice president, supposed to take over after Roosevelt died. They threw him out and they put in this guy named Truman, who was a haberdasher from the Midwest. You know what a haberdasher is? He just sold men's clothing. And he had no idea of anything. And they used him as a front. They controlled Truman, and he set up the Cold War. 1947, on history, the United States set up the Cold War, decided to divide everything that they set up in 1945 for the United Nations. And the first victim was the World Federation of Trade Unions. And so we had one trade union movement, which was great for the working class, to fight against world capitalists. And they deliberately destroyed that under the guise of fighting the communists. And the first thing they did, the Truman people, was to set up the McCarthy period in this country to get rid of the communists. Remember that anybody should know that the CIO unions that were built in the 1930s, there were 18 of them. 11 were led by avowed communists, members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and the government did not want that. So they deliberately set up the McCarthy period, and they drove all these people out of the unions. So the unions that came together in 1955, the CIO and the AFL was a different CIO. It was a CIO that was already a mirror image of the AFL. There was no difference. So that's the history. Thank you.
And we're going to start the second portion with some more clips from the interview.
And to do that, especially in Chile, which had historically one of the largest, strongest working classes in the hemisphere. They had to totally destroy the labor movement in Chile. And they tried it starting in 46. And I won't go into that detail because I do have every campaign they ran to take over the leadership of the main labor organization, which eventually was called the Coup, the CUT. And they tried to take it over. When they couldn't take it over, they formed another confederation that was totally US supporters that failed utterly. So they went back into the coup. They paid for the membership for all the right-wing unions they had created. And two people, one from AFL and one from an ITS, told me literally, we created unions we could work with. In other words, we weren't interested in reform. We were interested in destroying the people's organizations and putting in a front that was controlled by the AFL-CIO. And the AFL-CIO from the day, well, years before Allende was even elected, was involved in fighting communists. And as a matter of fact, it was in the 1950s that Serafino Romualdi wrote a notice, a letter to Mini saying, you know, we've been putting money in these anti-communist organizations in Chile for a decade and a half, and all we have had is one failure after another. So it wasn't just AFL. AFL was the front. It was very effective. It relied on the ITSs, and most of the people that were funneled into Chile were agents. Now, I'll just tell you, I lived there, and every housing project had a military commander living at it. And the ones they promised in Chile, they were never built. They promised them, first of all, to the communication workers affiliate, and they promised them to the maritime affiliate. But they didn't deliver, but they worked. And actually, someone in the State Department said to me that they looked for people who would take bribes. And so they came in contact with the most corrupt, disgusting people in Chile. And that's who they would recruit. And they paid bribes. One of the things they gave to the Chilean Maritime Union was an incredibly advanced ship-to-shore radio system that was used during the coup, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to communicate. US Navy ships were in the port at Valpo for Project Unitas, Unity. So the US was totally involved, the Navy almost more than anybody else. And it was naval intelligence that okayed the murder of Charlie Horman and Frank Tarucci.
And who are they?
They were two Americans who, like me, went to Chile to see what it was like to build a peaceful road to socialism. And they were active in a group that was known as FIN, F-I-N, that stood for the Spanish Fuente de Información Norteamericana, or the source of North American information. We would take articles out of NACLA, translate them into Spanish, write articles on the movements in the United States and articles on the undermining of Allende that was going on, origin in the United States. And they were both involved. And the Chileans would not murder until they got an okay from the US. And certainly Charlie had been in Valpo right before the coup and run into all these military people. And he became very suspicious. And one of them gave him a ride back to his house, where he was later picked up after the coup and taken to the stadium. Both Frank was also taken to the stadium. They found literature in his apartment, but they didn't take his housemate. And And so it wasn't until the disappearance of both of them that people and some congressmen got involved to go down to Chile to find out what had happened. And that's what the movie Missing is based on. It's really a brilliant movie about the cooperation between the US military and the Chilean, US intelligence and the Chilean, in bringing off the coup and getting rid of hated US citizens. And to do that, especially
The AFL's role leading up to the September 11th, 1973 coup. The class consciousness, I'm sorry, the class consciousness, militancy, and organization of the Chilean proletariat has consistently frustrated the AFL-CIO's attempts to subvert the political struggles of that country's workers. Allende's electoral victory in 1970 was precisely what AFL had feared but was unable to prevent. From the moment that the UP, or Popular Unity, took over the reins of government, the U.S. labor network started operating to overthrow it. Their work was developed in coordination with the overall U.S. and Chilean right-wing strategy. Their strategy specifically was based on three main objectives: to sabotage the economy, build a right-wing mass-based opposition to the Allende government, and undermine, however possible, the unity of the Chilean working class. From 1970 to 1973, a number of Chilean right-wing trade unionists moved back and forth between Chile and the United States. During this period, working in concert with the CIA, the AFL helped train them in a special school set up by the Institute in Front Royal, Virginia. And this was this training center I mentioned was basically donated to them by the CWA. Most came from strategically placed right-wing unions, or in many cases, these unions were formed through AFL. In 1972, at least 6 groups of Chilean trade unionists toured the United States, meeting with important AFL-CIO, AFL, and International Trade Secretariat leaders. The groups were made up of unions whose leadership consistently opposed Allende and played strategic roles in the activities, culminating in the September 11th military coup. The AFL trainees later played significant roles in the truck owners' lockout. And in popular consciousness here, it is believed that this was a truck driver strike. No, it was a lockout for the truck owners. Did not come from the working class, and other employer-inspired strikes. Economic harassment of the Popular Unity government, which helped set the stage for the military coup. Supporting the campaign of economic sabotage, already launched by the U.S. and Chilean ruling class, was a high priority. Whereas the multinational corporations and the U.S. government implemented a blockade of Chile throughout international, financial, and commercial encirclement, AFL and its relied on select friends and agents, well placed throughout Chile's trade and professional union structure, to spearhead strikes to disrupt production. Any strike in a strategic sector of the economy, copper or transport, for example, could weaken further an economy already under attack. In April 1973, the right-wing Central Confederation of Chilean Professionals, or CUPROCH, as well as individual professional gremios, or trade associations, and craft unions at the large El Teniente copper mine, walked out on strike. Copper workers in Chile had always received better contracts than the majority of workers, including periodic automatic cost of living increases. In early 1973, they received one of these increases to offset inflationary trends, which due to the blockade were high. Shortly after, however, The UP raised the wages of all workers by 100% to make up for the increased cost of living. In April, and this is why they went on strike, Kuproch and the craft unions demanded that the government pay them their initial raise, the cost of living increasement, as well as the 100% increase given to the other workers. The government quickly settled with the majority of mine workers and they returned to work. The technical workers, however, did not return. For 3 months, they sabotaged production in the mine, provoking a loss of approximately 990 million in foreign currency and providing a focal point for reactionary attacks on the government. And keep in mind, that's 90 million in 1973. Julio Bazan, a political analysis for former Chilean President Eduardo Frei and top-ranking engineer in the nationalized copper industry, became president of Kuproch during the 1972 truck owners lockout. After his ascension, the union suddenly became flush with cash. Kuproch's then vice president became concerned with the sudden influx of money and tried to trace its origins. Unfortunately, Kuproch was the last stop on the AFLD's ITS financial conduit line, and his inability to trace the money back to its source was a feather in the cap for AFLD's union-to-union program. Now this is AFLD's role during the coup. After years of plotting and preparation, AFLD, together with the reactionary Chilean trade unionists, helped provide strategic support to the right-wing offensive, which brought down the UP government. Even as the armed forces bombed and raided factories, these traitors issued statements praising the new military junta and prepared to take command of a labor movement that had never been within their grasp. What, in fact, did these AFL-CIO agents win for Chile's working class? Nothing. 20 to 40,000 people were immediately massacred, and the new military junta was the most ultra-right anti-labor government in Chile's history, which is common of governments the AFL-CIO unfortunately helped the U.S. government overthrow. In one of its first decrees, the junta abolished Chile's powerful Central Labor Confederation, placed all trade unions in abeyance, and outlawed strikes together with any form of labor protest. Without the formal rights of any kind, Chilean workers had been subjected to speed-ups, enforced overtime, continual surveillance, and the disciplinary system on after-work roundups of potential dissidents that included torture and even murder. And we're going to go back to the interview.
Central was the AFL-CIO AFLD in this coup.
Totally. The people that came in, they sent in, who were helping. They built Kuproch, which almost single-handedly brought down the government in April because it closed down a copper mine, which accounted for the majority of income that they got in foreign exchange. They identified, as they do here too, they identified all the lefties to the military. Everything they found out about people, they gave to American intelligence, who gave it to Chilean intelligence. They basically put a target on progressive leaders in the labor movement so they would be killed. They were Orlando Signs puppies who were, telling people who you had to kill. And so it wasn't minor, and it wasn't just that they were teaching a form of trade unionism that had absolutely no use in Latin America. And there were two people from the State Department who told me directly, I would quote if I had my fingers on it, but told me directly that they trained people to work with the CIA. They gave cover to the CIA people, and the money this was great. There's a report that the CIA put out, Covert Action in Chile, which I managed to have a copy of. There's still things that are whited out in it, but I got a copy of it probably because I testified in front of the Senate committee. And it gives amount of money. It points out from the very beginning, covert United States involvement in Chile in the decade between 1963 and 73 was continuous and massive. They go on to point out, it's the Senate Select Committee report on covert action in Chile, 1963 to 73. And it talks, for example, that between 70 and the military coup, $8 million was spent covertly. Now, that doesn't mean that was the sum total, but they go on to specify that when the money went kind of legally through AFL, that money was changed on the black market. Its value was 5 times the value of the escudo. So that it wasn't, 8 million, it was 40 million in 1970 dollars. And they gave it, one of the main recipients right before the October stoppage was SAFOFA, the National Association of Manufacturers. The richest organization in Chile got this huge millions of dollar gift from the United States through the ITS that went to Fatherland and Liberty to carry out chaos throughout the country. Because the head of SAFOFA, like the head of the Agricultural Society, were both the 2 key leaders of the Commando and leaders of the far right and founders of Fatherland and Liberty, the fascist organization. 1 million ties bind them.
And it sounds like this is continued in Ukraine and many other countries, that the AFL-CIO, through the National Endowment of Democracy, which resulted from the exposure of the AIFLD, these hearings led to a change. But it sounds like they operate in a similar way. The operations.
Let me point out that the ITSs became all apparent right after they discovered all these front foundations that were channeling CIA money into the countries. Suddenly, the ITSs were active organizations channeling all this money. They were just the cover that took the place of the private foundations. AFL has been replaced by the Solidarity Center that is still funded by AID, the Agency for International Development.
And with that we're going to break for our last round of questions and comments.
As it sounds like this was recent, they mentioned Ukraine.
Yes, the interview was from last September.
Right, so it's recent. Ukraine is in the news ever since the 2014 overthrow of the government. In this country, the media is calling the Ukraine democratic. It shows you where the media is coming from. Remember, the media is owned by the corporate interest, what we always call the capitalist. It's not owned by average, everyday people. So the media, whenever they talk, they're talking out the mouth of the capitalist class. Just remember that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I know that it's saying that AFL was the major front in this, and it was getting its funding from the USAID. But I was just curious if, as far as the AFL-CIO's part, were they using any of the dues fund or the funds raised by the dues of the union members?
Yes, there was dues money used as well.
Okay, I was just curious how to, like, so in the AFL-CIO, they don't need to disclose to their members that where the money is going?
Well, at that level, to the members, I'm not so sure, but there is tax filings they have to submit.
I mean, members pay international dues, and then that gets divided up even after it's sent off. So it's not something that makes its way down to local meetings.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a book recommendation, which you can find on the Internet Archive, called Thy Will Be Done. And it's all about the Rockefellers, David Rockefeller, I believe it was, in Latin America. And there is quite a bit about the labor unions from country to country, what they did with them. That's all.
A lot of people write off the AFL-CIO because of its history and involvement in this. But talking about it and starting a conversation about it and trying to correct the mistakes that were made is far more productive and constructive in trying to rebuild what was lost over the years. And the best way to, expose a demagogue or to challenge them and to make things better is to fight for what they say they believe in. So when you want to try and improve union democracy or international solidarity, you try and fight for it, and the people who are just there to say those things that people want them to say, they get exposed for it. And so we have to keep fighting for that. We have to keep fighting for a true international solidarity and not the CIA crap. This is just one part of it. So I hope everyone enjoyed the lesson.
Labor United Educational League. You can be found on various platforms. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, as Facebook. As well as soon you'll be able to find us on YouTube. Where we will be posting previous sessions from the Harry Bridges School of Labor. You can follow our website at louisville.us, as well as our publication at labortoday.louisville.us. And look out tomorrow. We should have a nice article from Ruth Needleman that she wrote in 1974 following the coup in Chile. You'll get some more detail there. As well as if you check in the chat, I shared the link to the full interview, and we'll put it out on all our socials so everybody could see it. And we're going to close out with a song from Venezuelan activist Victor Yara, who was among those massacred by the Pinochet regime after the coup. And
el derecho de vivir, poeta Ho Chi Minh, que golpea de Vietnam a toda la humanidad. Ningún cañón borrará el surco de tu arrozal.